thank you for listening to my talk. My name is Eleanor Stribling, and this is Sign Me Up, Choosing and Using a Registration Package for Your Django project. This talk was originally given at DjangoCon US on July 18th, 2016. So let's get started. A couple of things about this talk. First of all, it's novice level. So basically what that means is somebody who has a little bit of familiarity with Django, but is not really an expert and probably hasn't done this before. If you built an app in a tutorial once, you will be fine. I think you will take something from this talk. Teachers and mentors of junior devs or developers who don't know Django very well may also benefit from this talk because it does kind of start from a high level and it breaks things down quite a bit. So if you need to know how to teach somebody or get a new sensitivity to what's more difficult for someone who's less comfortable in Django, this might be a good talk for you. A tech note using Python 3, Django 1.9, and Django Registration Redux in this talk. If you have earlier versions of any of those, your code might look a little bit different, fair warning. I'll be covering the implementation of the registration flow today. So this is basically the library Django Registration Redux leveraging the user model built into Django. And what it does is create email authorization if you choose to include that. Also a mechanism for people to reset their password and log in and sign out. I won't be covering email setup or site deployment. That's out of the scope of this talk. However, I will show you how to test it in your local environment. And if you're interested in how to do that, you can take a look at the repo in my GitHub for Valise, which I'll talk about in a second, which was my original project that inspired this talk, where I did set up the SendGrid plugin on Heroku, so you can see the configuration for it there. So the origin story of this talk was that application I mentioned called Valise, and this was my very first real Python project. It ran in the command line, and basically it made an API call to get weather at your destination for a trip. You could say if your trip was business or casual, and you could say whether you wanted a male or female traditional wardrobe, and your destination, of course, in the US and Canada, and it would tell you what to pack. And so again, that was a command line program, and I wanted to do something a little bit more complex with it. I used some JavaScript, so I wanted to create an application. And so I used that idea as a way to build my very first full Django application without a tutorial on my own. And I wanted to use registration because I wanted to be able to sign users in and let them save their previous trips. So a couple of learning objectives that really stemmed from some of the difficulties I had with this project as someone learning Django. First of all, I'm going to talk about the criteria and resources for choosing a registration package in the first place. There are, in fact, quite a few. Next, I'll talk about the pieces of the registration package and how it all fits in the Django framework, because for most beginners, myself included, it was very difficult when I was first using Django to really understand what was going on. And very few tutorials really break that down, so I wanted to do that here. And finally, I'll talk about a couple of gotchas that aren't super clear in the documentation or completely absent from it that really mess me up. And they're kind of silly things, but they take a long time to figure out if you don't know what to look for. So I'm hoping I can save you some pain and suffering by showing you that. First, choosing a registration package. And I should note my son was an inspiration for this talk because he's always very curious about everything, and he tries everything really hard. So it's one of the reasons I wanted to try with my programming, and so there are pictures of him and inspiration from him throughout this talk. And here the balloons are meant to represent all the options of registration packages that you have. So 4 criteria I think are really important. Matching product requirements. So I work primarily, I guess officially, in product right now. And it's very important to think about what your end goals are, I think, when choosing this. I think a lot of the time we pick things we know, or we pick things that we think will be easy or fast. And that usually doesn't cut it in the long term. And if you do that, you might end up with something that is more painful to get rid of than it would have been just to think about the requirements initially. And I would say as a product manager, if you have a good product manager, they'll probably be thinking one version ahead, at least. So talk to them about the future versions and choose a package maybe that has a lot of the features that you want to include later, or that can support those features in some way with another library, even if you don't implement it all right away. Compatibility is important too. So I mentioned what the versions I was using of everything at the beginning, because you should pick things that are compatible with the versions of Django and Python that you're using. And most of the times would involve upgrading Django, which shouldn't be too painful, but you never know. So I would factor that in. But more likely it might involve upgrading Python. I know a lot of people still use 2.7, so you might need to move to 3. So that's something to think about and evaluate when you're picking your package, just for the time it will take and the resources it will take. Maintenance and usage are also very important, and by this I mean maintenance and usage of the package. I take a look at repos to see recent contributions. I look at the number of forks to try and figure out how current people keep this code. And that's important because if you do have a problem, chances are someone else has found it, and there might be someone to fix it if it's well maintained. You might find a diamond in the rough, you might be on the bleeding edge or something like that, but there are definitely pros and cons of that. So if you need something that's stable in production, or you're just not too confident that you can muddle through it, I would definitely pick something a bit more stable and trusted. And finally, that leads me into the quality of documentation, the official documentation, and of other tutorials that exist out there on the internet. This was very important to me because I was working essentially alone, and I didn't have other people to assist me all the time. So being able to find good documentation was really important. And I used some of the official docs for Django, but I had a lot of trouble with Django registration Redux documentation. So I looked at a lot of tutorials on the web. YouTube was one of my favorite places to go. The other option, of course, things like meetups or mentoring that you can do to get somebody who can help you figure these things out. But generally, as a rule of thumb, good documentation really should be a criteria for using things. I love this site, DjangoPackages.com, and I wanted to show it to you because it's very helpful in evaluating packages. So I'm showing you here all the different kinds of packages that are listed on the site. So it's super nerdy, and you might enjoy just browsing through it. But you can click all the way over to registration, as you see right there. And basically, it outlines a bunch of things I just talked about. Kind of the characteristics of each package, where the repo is, if it supports OAuth, if that matters to you, the number of times it's been forked or starred, a link to the documentation, if it supports OAuth, and if it is compatible with Django 1.5 or not. That's sort of the inflection point with Django. So it's a great site. I highly encourage you to check it out. There are a lot of Django packages there, so if there isn't data, you'll at least know that they exist. So I hope that you use that as a resource because it's a great one. Next, fitting Django registration Redux into the Django framework. So this for me was the hardest part of this project because I wasn't that familiar with the Django framework, nor was I very able to learn it fast enough to make the implementation of Django registration Redux easy. But I want to show you some things that I hope will make it easier for you. So I made this little kind of baby app to illustrate how Django registration Redux works. My previous app was a little bit too complex for that, and I didn't want to muddy the waters for you if you want to download an example. But here it is. It's called Fairy Tale Reviews, also inspired by my son who loves fairy tales right now. And as you can see, the reviews that people have added, you can sign in or sign up in order to leave a review. So you can see them if you're anyone. This is a very early rough version of the registration form, and then if you want to sign in, I will do that here. Username, password, again, and I hit login. So once I do that, you can see the options on the top menu bar have changed to write a review and sign out. So now I can click on that and write a review. This is a form. I made the model in Django. It's a very, very not great model, but it works fine for this purpose. So you give a bunch of stars as you wish, you put in some text, and you hit submit review. All of that gets saved to a SQLite database, and then you can see there's my review, 5 stars for 12 Dancing Princesses, which you should check out. It's a great one. Then, of course, you can sign out. And there we go. So that's basically what the app does, the version that's in GitHub. So how do we get there? Well, this is the structure of the files and folders in your Django project. And I think that I could see this obviously in my Finder window, and I could see it when I typed ls in my terminal, but really wrapping my head around it required a picture, and not a lot of tutorials do that. So let me walk you through. So there's the manage.py, that's the thing that will help you basically control your app. Most people probably know it from typing Python manage py run server in order to start your app and run it locally. You've got the database, so in this case it's SQLite3, but of course you can have a Postgres database if you want to go in that direction. You have your project, so in this case it's called DjangoCon in the repo, so that's why it's called DjangoCon here. And you've got settings, URLs, and WSGI files, and those are made for you by Django. When you start an app, you make an app folder. In the example it's called reviews, which is why reviews is in brackets next to the word app. And then you get, let's see, there's 5 files: admin, apps, models, tests, and views.py. They get automatically created. Then you need to create one called forms.py. Then you create a folder called templates. So any basic Django tutorial goes over templates. Basically what this will contain is your base file, this one here, base.html, and this is the template that you will be extending with each view. So usually what's in this file is a top nav bar and a footer, typically. It's something you want to show up on every single page. Then I've got a folder called reviews, and this has got templates in it for the 2 views that you saw in the demo that weren't related to the sign-in. So that initial page where you see all the reviews, and then the page where you can write a review. Those 2 templates are in this file, reviews. And then finally, this last folder is something you'll need to create as well. It's called registration, and I'll show you in a minute where to get all of the files for all of the views involved in that. The red boxes indicate where you will need to change the files. These are files that you will need to alter in order to make Django Registration Redux work. This is something I didn't understand early on, and so I think it would be really important to take a careful look at this and follow along with where I make changes. So if you're ready to go, we can start to code. So in your virtual environment, first step, you can download Django Registration Redux, but I do pip installs because they're just so much easier and magical. So you just type this in your terminal. By the way, these are all Mac commands, so I'm sorry, Windows users, I don't know how to do this on a Windows machine, so forgive me. And then make sure you add it to your requirements. So next, you need to create a form for the user in forms.py. Now the reason you need to do this is, as I mentioned before, Django Registration Redux leverages the user model, which is built into Django. And the first thing you need to do is figure out which fields you need. So there are a bunch of them. Only some of them are things that you want to expose to a user. Username and password are the only 2 that are required. Also there's first and last name, which would probably be make the most sense for most applications. Then you can also extend the user model, and you can add things like quotes. You could let people upload pictures. You could add fields for things like hometown or phone number or something like that. There are lots of things you can do with that, but that's beyond the scope of this tutorial. So anyway, this is the code that you would need to have in your forms.py file in your app to make this work. So you need to import the forms, you need to import the user model, and then you have to create this class for a user form. The model is the user, and then the fields that you actually want to display are username, email, which is not required, but we do need it for this if we're going to do the 2-step authentication where someone gets an email. So I've included it here, and then password. And the order that you add these is going to be the order they show up on the form. So this to me was the most logical one, but you could change it if you wanted. The next step is to install the app in settings.py and then migrate. So the reason this is the installed apps variable, and as you can see there's a list. What's in the orange square is what most tutorials tell you to do, to make sure that you have django.contrib.sites, and to make sure that you have the registration app listed, so that's Django Registration Redux. Then that you put your app, reviews, which is the one I created, down at the bottom. This is going to be an issue later, so I just wanted to draw your attention to it here, but you do definitely need to add registration to installed apps. I'm not going to cover this in too much detail. It is in the repo, but there are a bunch of variables you can add here that control a lot of really important things about the user experience with Django Registration Redux. So for example, I think two of the most important ones are the login redirect URL, the two ones at the bottom here. The login redirect URL is the place that you're going to send people once they have logged in. So in this case, I'm just sending them back to the home page, those reviews. And then here, the login URL is accounts/login/. That will be always true if you're using this package. And you shouldn't rename it because you're going to mess yourself up. Okay, the third step is getting the registration templates. So as I mentioned before, there are actually a lot of views that you need for this because you need to show a password reset, a registration, a confirmation of registration, a login, and a logout. So there's a lot of stuff, and I originally tried to code this myself, but then I realized I didn't have to because this really nice person made a GitHub repo with all of the templates in it. As I said, there are quite a few, and this is showing you all of those templates. Oh, there's also the email as well. So there's a lot of stuff that you would need to do, and you could write all this code yourself, but why would you? You can just clone this repo and put the folder with the templates into your templates folder in your app, or just copy and paste all of the templates into your existing folder. Super easy, and then you can focus your time on customization and making them look awesome. The fourth step is to add to your urls.py file. So here you've got your admin URL pattern, your app URL pattern. Then you just add this line. You'll see it in the README if you can't see it too well on the screen. But basically this is saying to include all the registration backend URLs. So that's it. That's all you have to do in theory. So there are two big problems that held me back, like I mentioned before, two real gotchas, and I wanted to tell you about them here so these things don't happen to you. The first one is the custom templates didn't work. So I downloaded all of those templates from that repo for registration. I spent a bunch of time adding Bootstrap and some nice CSS. So here's my URL pattern, urls.py, the one in my project, not the one in my app. And so I figured that all of these are going to be customized when I go look at them. I put in things like this is a template in caps just to make sure that my template was actually working. So this is an earlier version of the site that you're seeing without all the styling. And then so you put in that one of those URLs and it gives you the Django administration page, which looks really nice but is not what I wanted. And it doesn't have my this is the template all in caps in it. So clearly it's not picking up my actual template. It's giving me some default template. Again, not what I wanted. So what do I do to fix this? Well, remember how I mentioned in the settings.py file and installed apps that the order actually did matter? This is where it matters. So here, see registration is second in here. I need to put it above Django contrib admin. And the reason for that is that if you don't put it first, the order does matter, and Django contrib admin is imported first and basically overwrites the registration stuff. I also found I have to put my app above registration. So there you see reviews and then registration. I think that's because all of the templates are in the reviews app folders. If you were doing a bigger project with more applications, you might want to do that differently. But yep, there it is. This is a template. That's one of mine that I was testing. And I'm going to try the login one. This is a login form. That was definitely me. And we're not seeing the Django admin at this point. So that is fixed. So that was a really tricky one. That took me some time to figure out. The next problem I had was testing emails in dev. So let me show you what happens if you don't set this up right. So I had everything done, but before I went to production, I wanted to make sure it worked. So what I did was I tried to create a new user. And this form does work. I did create a new user. But the problem was what happened when I tried to submit it. So here I am setting a password, everything's happy, and it works, I think, until I click submit. And then I get this giant ugly error about the connection being refused. So what happened here? Well, Django Registration Redux tells Django you should be sending an email, and Django had no idea how to send this email because I had not set up email. This was not live on the internet. This is just in my local dev. So it had nothing to do with the email. So what do you do to fix this? Well, you can print to the console. This is actually really simple. It involves one line of code, in settings.py, and the code is this one line here called email backends. And this backend includes the word console, which is really important because this is what tells it to send that email to the console. So before I actually did create the user, so that's why I'm doing Eleanor Stribling 11 here, so I don't get an error on the username, because the username always must be unique. So I didn't want to get that. And you click submit. Oh, and now I have, you are now registered, activation email sent. Awesome. So what that means is I should look in the console here. And I can see the email, which you can customize. It's one of the files in registration if you copied from that repo. And you just take that URL and you paste that sucker into the URL address bar. Now, one thing to mention here, I set it to localhost :8000 by changing the site ID. And the repo, oh, there we go, account activated. And the repo instructions have a couple of ways that you can do that, but I'm not going to cover it in this tutorial. So that was the second problem, all fixed. Here are some resources for this talk. I would say the sample app is a great place to start. You can use that to your heart's content. Feel free to clone it, look at the code online, whatever you want. The original Django app, Valise, is live at valise.com, so if you want to see something in production working, you can go for that. There is a GitHub repo for this with Heroku configuration with SendGrid for the email, so if you want to check that out, you can do that at this link. Just a reminder about the tech stack, Django 1.9, here's the link to the documentation, Django Registration Redux 1.4. I'm going to assume you can find Python. Just a reminder that you will need to use Django 1.8 or a newer version with this version of Django Registration Redux. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening, and good luck with your project.